Hello everyone, welcome to HIM 225. This will be the first in a series of lectures covering Chapter 17 in your textbook, which covers Chapter 10 in ICD-10. In your textbook, we're on page 406. And as we begin this chapter, I want to remind you to look over the abbreviations and the acronyms at the beginning of the chapter. Go to the end of the chapter and look at those glossary terms. And also look at your homework assignment and look at those questions that you have been assigned for homework so you have an idea of what your focus needs to be. Now, we're going to go over the coding guidelines, which really are not extensive for this chapter, but let's start by looking at Chapter 10 in the Integrated Code Book. And we do have a note here. When a respiratory condition is described as occurring in more than one site and is not specifically indexed, it should be classified to the lower anatomic site. For instance, tracheobronchitis to bronchitis in J40. So they mean, of course, the lower anatomic site within this respiratory system. We do have a use an additional code, and of course these are external type things, tobacco smoke and things that impact the respiratory system. Then we do have an excludes note here for those conditions that would be coded in addition to these codes from this chapter. We can see that the section list is not extensive. And let's go to this first guideline. Acute exacerbation of chronic obstructive bronchitis and asthma. Basically, it tells us that in these two categories, J44 and J45, which J44 for COPD, J45 for asthma, that there are codes that distinguish between uncomplicated cases and those that have an acute exacerbation. And it tells us that the acute exacerbation is a worsening of a decompensation of a chronic condition. And the acute exacerbation is not equivalent to an infection superimposed on a chronic condition, but an exacerbation may be triggered by an infection. So if we let's look at these codes, and we'll just look at these categories, J44, other chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and we can see that we do have instructional notes here. Code also asthma, use additional code for those types of conditions, and you can just look through these codes. Chronic COPD, and of note, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is COPD, and that's how you commonly will see it documented. You won't see them write out chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. You will see that abbreviation COPD, and that's how I'll refer to it. So a COPD with a lower respiratory infection, COPD with an acute exacerbation, and then COPD unspecified. And very commonly, this J44.9 code is the code that you will be using because a lot of times the chart just documents that the patient has COPD. So just be aware of that. Now let's look at J45, category J45. And I just click this down green arrow to get down to this category, and this is asthma. And again, we have these instructional notes at the beginning of this particular chapter. Now, I wanted to show you, in the index, you go to disease, pulmonary, and then chronic obstructive, and then you can see these additional subterms that take you to those codes. Asthma, a little different. Okay, so when we look at asthma, this is a pretty sizable category. All the way down. So you have to be careful when you're using the index and coding in this particular category. But you can see asthma with COPD or chronic obstructive bronchitis, that's not COPD. Asthma with chronic obstructive bronchitis, it's sending you to J44.9, so it's sending you back to the previous category, which has the COPD codes. Asthma with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, J44.9, and then you can see these different exacerbations. And then as we scroll down, we can see that asthma is further subdivided as to mild, moderate, and severe, and those codes are listed. Take the time to go through this category and just look at the different codes that you have available. Now, if a patient just has a documentation that they have asthma, this is the code that we'll assign, J45.909, and that is actually the default code at the beginning of this category. So if all you have documented is that the patient has asthma, that's the code that you're going to use. So let's look at this first example in the textbook. So the patient was seen for management of exacerbation of COPD triggered by acute bronchitis. So let's take a look. And my internet's slow, so I type and I lose characters. I need to... Okay. So if we look at our code for chronic obstructive bronchitis, we have acute exacerbation, but we have acute bronchitis, and that's what this patient has, is COPD with acute bronchitis. So COPD with acute bronchitis, J44.0. We look at this code and you see that it tells you to code also the identified infection. So this tells us that we have an infection, but it doesn't tell us what kind of infection it is. So we also are going to need to code the acute bronchitis. So if we look at acute or subacute, we see this code J20.9. So we will add that code. Now in the next example, the patient has asthma and is being treated for pneumonia. So in this instance, we are using the default code. The default code for pneumonia is J18.9. And they're being treated for pneumonia. The condition determined to have occasioned the admission is the pneumonia. So we'll sequence that first, and then we will use the default code for the asthma, J45.909. Now, our next guideline talks about acute respiratory failure. And the respiratory failure can definitely be a principal diagnosis code, and it actually groups to a DRG that has a high weight and high reimbursement. So a code from subcategory J96. So why don't we go and look at J96. Let's look at the codes that are in that particular section. Sorry. Okay, J96, respiratory failure not elsewhere classified. So, patients can either have acute respiratory failure, they can have chronic respiratory failure, and they can have acute and chronic respiratory failure, J96.2. It can be assigned as the principal diagnosis when it meets the definition of the principal diagnosis. your book tells you chapter-specific coding guidelines such as obstetrics, poisoning, HIV, and newborn also provide sequencing direction and take precedence. So I can tell you that there are times when an OB patient may have acute on chronic respiratory failure, and when that is the case, those pregnancy codes take precedence. So there are some chapters that kind of supersede that general guidance. Okay, let's look at this example on page 407. The patient came to the ER in acute respiratory failure. The patient was intubated, admitted to ICU, and then following admission, the patient was started on antibiotics for pneumonia. The patient was on mechanical ventilation for 24 hours. So in this instance, we have coded the acute respiratory failure as the principal diagnosis code. We have the default code for pneumonia. Then we have actually coded the fact that the patient was intubated and they were on the ventilator. So that's what the two procedure codes are. Now, the guidelines tell us that if both the respiratory failure and another acute condition meet the definition for principal diagnosis, then basically we can choose either one to be the principal diagnosis. So if I go to acute failure, respiratory acute, J96.00. There is my code that I will verify in the tabular. And then I'm also coding pneumonia. So I can put in pneumonia. And I will find my default code of J18.9. Now, if we go to the index, we have two things we're coding here. We have the intubation, the insertion of the endotracheal tube. So if we go to insertion of device in trachea, we will see 0BH1. And this is the table that we go to. And this is done through the mouth, so it's via natural or artificial opening. And this was an intraluminal device, an endotracheal airway. So we have our code 0BH17EZ. And then we can also look for mechanical ventilation. So if we go to mechanical ventilation, it says C, performance respiratory. So that takes us to table 5A1. And this patient was intubated for 24 hours. So we get to choose 24 to 96 consecutive hours. It was ventilation, and there's no qualifier. So 5A1, 945Z. Now this mechanical ventilation code is sequenced first because it impacts reimbursement. And so that's why you might say, well, why does a code from extracorporeal assistance trump or a code from the surgical section? And it's because it impacts reimbursement. Now, on the bottom of page 407, acute respiratory failure as a secondary diagnosis. And definitely it can be sequenced as a secondary diagnosis if it occurs after admission, or if it's present on admission but doesn't meet the definition of a principal diagnosis. And at the top of 408, we can see that this patient was admitted from the clinic for IV antibiotics for pneumonia. Then a couple hours after admission, the patient's condition deteriorated and the patient developed acute respiratory failure. So again, we're sequencing the pneumonia as the principal diagnosis. That's the default code for pneumonia. And then J9600 is the code for acute respiratory failure. Acute respiratory failure and another acute condition. Basically, if a patient's admitted with respiratory failure and they have another acute condition, an example might be a myocardial infarction or a CVA or aspiration pneumonia, the principal diagnosis won't be the same in every situation. This applies whether the other acute condition is a respiratory or non-respiratory condition. The principal diagnosis will depend on the circumstances of the admission, and if both the respiratory failure and that other acute condition equally meet the definition of a principal diagnosis, and there are no chapter-specific sequencing rules, then either of those conditions can be sequenced. From a reimbursement standpoint, you would sequence the condition that had the highest weighted DRG that resulted in the most reimbursement. So in this next example, the second example on 408, the patient was admitted to the hospital in acute respiratory failure due to congestive heart failure. The patient was intubated, they were on mechanical ventilation for 2 days, and they responded well to IV diuretics. Well, in this case, both the respiratory failure and the heart failure meet the definition of principal diagnosis, but we're going to sequence that acute respiratory failure first, followed by the code for congestive heart failure, and then again, we have our 5A code for the mechanical ventilation and the OBH code for the intubation. And I'm going to end this lecture here. And your question for this lecture is from exercise 17.4 on page 416. I want you to answer number 7, decompensated COPD. And in the next lecture, I'm going to finish up these guidelines and then also go over your homework assignment. And that will conclude this lecture.